Hi, and welcome to the Intech Center on Climate Adaptation's education session on natural infrastructure, the win-win-win approach to reducing flooding and erosion. It's great that you could join us, and I really hope you're enjoying the annual conference. My name is Joanna Eyquem, and I'm Director of Climate Programs at the Intech Center. We are an applied research center based at the University of Waterloo in Canada. We work with communities, businesses, and governments to accelerate climate adaptation across the country. Two of our 5 key areas of work are flooding and natural infrastructure, as you can see in the photographs on this slide. We also work to reduce risks associated with wildfire and extreme heat and actively engage the financial sector to work to reduce climate risk. I am a fluvial geomorphologist by training, and working with natural processes to manage flood and erosion risk has been at the heart of my career for over 20 years. I hope that by demonstrating the value of natural infrastructure in reducing flood and erosion risk, as well as achieving multiple benefits, you will be able to see how you can increasingly use natural infrastructure in your own projects. So here's a quick overview of the agenda we'll be covering in this session. Firstly, we'll look at the context of why we need this session in the first place and what we mean by natural infrastructure. This will be followed by digging into some of the methods and benefits of natural infrastructure and why I've called the session the win-win-win approach. It really could have been more wins. We'll then look at how you can take action yourself and how the project evaluation process can really be used to consider the economic, social, and environmental value of using natural infrastructure and how this may compare to some more traditional solutions. We'll finish with a review of progress in Canada and on the international stage and some key opportunities for the future. I'd just like to draw your attention to the photograph on this slide. It's a picture of my 2 young sons at the wetland that we're lucky to have near our house. I put it here so that we can start thinking of some of the other benefits that natural infrastructure can have, as well as reducing flooding and erosion. Simon Sinek advises us to start with the question, why? Why do we need this session? Why is using natural infrastructure not already so mainstream that it already makes sense to everybody? The bottom line is that natural infrastructure are assets that we use and need, but they're also assets that we have not protected or managed effectively. They are victim to economic market failure and the tragedy of the commons. Let me explain a bit. Natural infrastructure is a public good that provides us with a whole range of services, including regulation of flooding and erosion that we're talking about today. However, the infrastructure and services they offer are not traded in typical markets. Therefore, they have no direct monetary value. We essentially receive these services for free in our current economic framework. Because people can benefit, even if they do not pay for the services, increased pressures are placed on services. For example, urbanization has historically increased runoff, but river channels are required to drain the extra runoff away, which in many cases increase flooding and erosion downstream. And because it's not straightforward to assign a monetary value, the costs of damage or benefits of restoration of natural infrastructure are also not factored into economic decision making. But the truth is that we do value natural infrastructure, and it does provide valuable services that we need to support our economy. So we're ultimately making decisions that are not economically sound and that diminish our natural capital. This is true both at a global and national scale, but also often at the project scale. Natural infrastructure is often framed as an environmental issue, but this is changing. You just have to listen to Davos discussions and read thought leadership materials from the economic sector to see that this is an area that businesses are becoming very concerned about. It's like that wave cartoon that you might have seen. First, we're hit by COVID. Next, there's a recession. Next, there's climate change. And after that, there's biodiversity collapse. You might have seen the World Economic Forum publish the New Nature Economy series back in 2020. The series highlights why nature matters to businesses and the economy, and there's a link at the bottom of this slide. As an aside, I've tried to reference the key resources I've used throughout this session so that you can follow up with extra reading where you want to find out more. So the World Economic Forum estimated that $44 trillion of economic value generation, over half the world's total GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. They also highlight that fighting climate change is critical, but not enough to halt biodiversity loss and safeguard nature. And I find this interesting because much of the work we are doing today to manage flooding and erosion is currently framed in the context of climate adaptation and the need for us to build resilience. However, there is also more that we as flood and erosion risk professionals can achieve in relation to nature through the methods that we use. To further emphasize that natural infrastructure is not just an environmental issue, we can turn to looking at the cost of catastrophic losses in Canada. Damage for severe weather events across Canada hit $2.4 billion in 2020, and this is the fourth highest loss year since records began. And we need to note that this graph excludes events that are not categorized as catastrophic, which is defined as events where losses are over $25 million. So therefore, lesser events that fall under this threshold are not reflected here. In addition, this is only insured loss data. It's estimated that for each dollar shown here, the government, businesses, and individuals pay another $3 to $4. So factoring this in, we can start hitting upwards of $10 billion in losses on an annual basis due to extreme weather events. The graph also illustrates that losses are increasing in Canada. There are a number of factors underlying this increase. The degradation of natural infrastructure, for example, destruction or draining of wetlands, deforestation, channelization of rivers, and the disconnection from their floodplains, is a contributing factor that effectively reduces our resilience to flooding. Climate change and an increase in high-intensity rainfall events are also projected to increase flood risk in Canada, particularly in urban areas. We've been talking about natural infrastructure, but what really is this? And how does it fit with the concept of nature-based solutions that are being increasingly discussed, particularly in the context of climate action? In a publication in 2018 relating to the underutilization of natural infrastructure, the Intact Centre defined natural infrastructure as a strategically planned and managed network of natural lands such as forests, wetlands, and other open spaces, which conserves or enhances ecosystem values and functions and provides associated benefits to human populations. In Canada, we also hear terms used such as natural heritage systems, functional river corridors, and ecological corridors to describe these kind of natural assets. Natural infrastructure is also embedded in the concept of nature-based solutions. In 2020, you may have seen that the International Union for Conservation of Nature issued a global standard for nature-based solutions that included the following definition: actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So nature-based solutions include infrastructure, and it's interesting to note that the IUCN identified both natural infrastructure and green infrastructure. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Green infrastructure is a term that is currently being used to describe a lot of different types of infrastructure in Canada. And I imagine that in other countries where you are, you see the same situation. Green infrastructure can be seen as an umbrella term covering natural, enhanced, and engineered assets. Natural assets, similar to the definition that we just saw for natural infrastructure, includes intact ecosystems, including wetlands, rivers, forests, coastal marshes, dunes, and other naturally occurring habitats. This is different to enhanced assets, which may mimic natural function and incorporate vegetation, but are not what we would term as natural. For example, we might be talking here about urban trees, urban parks, bioswales, and rain gardens. There are also engineered assets which are fully engineered but aim to mimic physical processes, such as increasing infiltration or storing water to attenuate flows. So green infrastructure may be used to refer to all of these types of assets, and use has also recently been expanded to refer to infrastructure that will help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For this presentation, we'll be focusing on natural infrastructure and in particular natural assets. Now that we've discussed why we need to talk about natural infrastructure and what it is, let's get more into the nitty-gritty to discuss their benefits, starting with reducing flooding and erosion risks, since that's what's brought most of you to the conference and this education session in the first place. Natural infrastructure can be used in 4 key ways to reduce and slow down flows and reduce flood risk. The first is to increase storage, for example, by reactivating floodplains and reconnecting them with their rivers, and by restoring wetlands. We can also increase roughness to slow down the flow, for example, through river restoration, restoring meanders. We can also increase losses through infiltration and evapotranspiration by protecting and restoring woodlands, for example. And all these actions can help to desynchronize peak flows where tributaries and the timing of peaks are problematic. The majority of these measures also help to reduce soil and river erosion. Essentially, natural infrastructure actions aim to work with natural processes by protecting natural assets that already exist and restoring valuable functions that have been lost and are having an adverse impact on flood and erosion risk. This diagram was taken from the site of the catchment-based approach in the UK. You may hear by my accent that that is where I'm originally from, and a lot of progress has been made in working to mainstream natural infrastructure solutions. This is termed in the UK as natural flood management, and there are now dedicated funding streams for these types of projects. Ideally, at this point, I wanted to show you a short animation developed by the Rhone, Mediterranean and Corsica Water Agency in France called A New Type of River Management is Coming. The animation was developed in French and translated to English by members of the European River Restoration Community of Practice in partnership with the UK Environment Agency. It's a simple and effective illustration of how natural infrastructure solutions can be applied to manage flood and erosion risk both in urban and rural contexts. It also shows the need to build solidarity and implement a coherent strategy within a catchment. This is particularly important since natural infrastructure projects do not provide the most benefit in terms of flood and erosion risk reduction at the site of intervention necessarily, but benefits often accumulate downstream. The video also helps to convey that flood and erosion risk management can involve numerous small actions within a catchment, rather than an engineered structure at the site of actual flooding. The idea is that in this way, we work to address the underlying causes of flood and erosion in a strategic way, rather than only reacting to alleviate the symptoms. I also find the animation is a useful tool for communicating with people from different backgrounds and encourage you to watch it yourself. You'll see the YouTube link is on each slide. Here I'm going to provide some of the key messaging, but you're going to be missing out on the inspirational music, I'm afraid. So in this first screenshot, here we see that in upstream areas, we can help to reconnect the river with the floodplain and helps protect vulnerable communities and areas downstream. Conversely, if we narrow our rivers and cut them off from their floodplains, the river runs more quickly, it makes its embankments more vulnerable, and also increases flood risk downstream. In the second snapshot from the same animation, we can see how natural infrastructure solutions can be used to help reduce flood risk in urban areas. In towns and cities, we can push back river embankments to widen the functional river corridor and recreate somewhat of a floodplain in the city. This also makes the riverside space more accessible for recreation and public access. The river spills onto the recreated floodplain during high flows. These flows are slowed and floodwaters are maintained within the widened river corridor. We can see this kind of solution implemented on a grand scale as part of the Room for the River project in the Netherlands, which began in 2007 and involves over 30 projects that were completed by 2018. A bit closer to me here in Canada is also the Don River Mouth Naturalization and Portland's Flood Protection Project in Toronto. This project is making space for the Don River to reduce risk in the city while restoring aquatic habitat and regenerating the waterfront. Conversely, in this slide, we see the all too common situation where development has encroached on the natural floodplain up to the riverbank, and the river itself has been channelized and straightened, reducing access to the riverside. As a result of this approach, flow moves more quickly, and during high flows, floodwaters spill out onto the surrounding urban area, causing flood damage and endangering public safety. As a fluvial geomorphologist, I would also note that this approach is likely to result in increased erosion downstream in river sections where banks are not hardened, since the river will be deprived of sediment in the area through the town where the concrete structure has been built, and flow velocities are typically increased. For those interested in sediment, like myself, there is also a section of the animation on the need to maintain natural sediment supply of gravels and bed material in order to maintain channel stability and aquatic habitat. In this context, stability refers to the natural equilibrium that rivers tend towards rather than rivers being static. In fact, a stable river typically exhibits natural erosion and deposition processes, and meandering channels, where we often see flood issues, also migrate across their floodplains. If rivers don't have enough sediment supply, they are likely to respond by eroding into their bed and banks, causing problems for infrastructure. With the help of the animation, we have briefly looked at the different methods to use river and floodplain-based natural infrastructure solutions. However, woodland management, runoff management, and coastal and estuary management solutions may also contribute to reducing flood and erosion risk. And different solutions may be combined together as part of a strategic catchment scale flood management plan. Probably by now, you're thinking, wow, this sounds all very good and logical, but does it actually work to reduce flooding and erosion? As I mentioned, the UK have been building the case for natural flood management solutions for over 20 years now, since the start of my career. Part of the work undertaken has been to develop an evidence directory to illustrate the current level of confidence in each of the 14 methods to manage flood and erosion risk that you see mentioned in the table on the slide. In addition, over 65 real-life case studies are presented. So I really encourage you to explore these different solutions and see where they've been implemented and what kind of results have been achieved. This area is also an area of active research in many countries, including here in Canada, where we are looking to scale up use of nature-based solutions, while at the same time tackling significant flood and erosion risk in the context of climate change. We have talked so far about one win. Natural infrastructure can be used to help reduce flooding and erosion by working with natural processes. But what about the other wins? The great news is that the same investment that is made in natural infrastructure can also deliver other potential co-benefits on top of this. One example is the contribution to cooling cities and tackling increasingly extreme heat, which is a very real and growing risk to public health and safety. Obviously, in this context, we immediately think about increasing the urban tree canopy. However, forested areas and natural oases that remain in urban centres can also provide what we call here in Montreal îles de fraîcheur, or cooling islands, as a way to address the urban heat island effect. River corridors themselves can provide cooling corridors where we can escape the heat. So this can be another win for natural infrastructure preservation and restoration in an urban context. Now we're on to win number 3, carbon storage. There's recently been significant movement, and over 120 countries have pledged to reach net zero by 2050. There's therefore increasing attention also being paid to how natural carbon sinks, such as forests and oceans, can be expanded to offset carbon emissions and help nations get to this net zero target. On the screen here, you'll see global carbon stocks. While not the largest, soils and vegetation are a pretty significant part of the puzzle at 2,300 gigatons. They are also a store that we can influence by restoring soils and vegetation to capture carbon. And all this can be part and parcel of the same wetland restoration or afforestation project that is being used to reduce flood risks, for example, i.e., it's another win. We should also bear in mind that carbon is not only stored in forests. According to the Geological Survey of Canada, the peat in Canada's wetlands stores almost 60% of all the carbon stored in soils across the country. So again, wetlands are fairly precious. Here you see a schematic showing different processes in wetland carbon sequestration. Carbon is stored both above ground in wetland vegetation and below ground in the soil. When vegetation dies, it sinks below the water and deposits carbon. In particular, peat acidity slows decomposition, creating layers of stored carbon as litter builds. So peatlands are particularly valuable in this respect. Again, to drive home the message that carbon storage doesn't just mean forests, here is a table that was produced showing carbon storage by habitat type. Again, we're back in the UK. This illustrates that while forests are evidently important in terms of the carbon stored in the trees themselves, heath, grasslands, swamps, and bogs actually store more carbon in their soils. This was a similar message that we just looked at for Canada. I'm not an expert in carbon storage, but colleagues who are provided the following advice. Firstly, not just to think of trees, but to think of soils, not just the vegetation. Think bigger. Think diversity of habitats. Think biodiversity in soils, and think wider ecosystem services, which all fits nicely with the messages that I've been providing to date regarding natural infrastructure and the catchment scale approach. Now we're on to win number 4. So we've actually already surpassed the win-win-win strategy that I had put in my title. At the time of recording, the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity is hot off the press, so I've been able to include a couple of key schematics in my presentation. The bottom line is that natural infrastructure protection and restoration helps maintain and increase our natural capital. This includes both biodiversity as well as the abiotic components that many of us here are very involved with, water, sediment, and air. Natural capital provides provisioning, regulating, and maintenance and cultural services. Both human capital and produced capital are intertwined with and dependent on natural capital, and this in turn is what our economy is built on. So logically, natural infrastructure and ecosystem services are of economic importance, even though they do not have a direct value and are widely thought of as free, as we discussed previously. So by implementing natural infrastructure projects, we can increase natural capital and support our economy. Now we've discussed some of the key wins that we can achieve with natural infrastructure. I wanted to look at the different functions and different scales of natural infrastructure. Here we can see on a graph of time or complexity against space. So we can see that we can go from individual actions up to project scale, community scale, landscape functional scale, and then I've included also the economic investment framework as governing all of the scales below. Now you can see that I've highlighted in red the landscape functional scale. And this is really because this is the scale, the river basin, the coastal cell, the ecological corridor, where really we get the benefit of natural infrastructure in planning. We can implement projects and community scale interventions, but really we don't get the full benefit from natural infrastructure unless we consider function. So hopefully up to this point, I've presented all the wins and the positive aspects of natural infrastructure that you think that it's a good idea to take action to implement these kind of projects. Now, the Intech Centre produced in 2018 a report looking at combating Canada's rising flood costs and the option of using natural infrastructure being underutilized. One of the conclusions of this report is that we should adopt a hierarchy of approaches to our natural infrastructure projects. So the first approach is to really protect what you have, because it's a lot more efficient to not destroy something than to have to come and replicate it in the future when you decide you need it. So number one is protect what you have. Number two is restore what you've lost. So we've seen degradation and destruction of wetlands in particular, which are of significant importance for managing flooding. So wetland restoration, where they previously were located, would seem a logical step if we want to rectify this situation. However, because we cannot create necessarily habitats that work or function where they would not exist naturally. And then the third approach is to build what you must. So following this protocol, we would protect, restore, and then only really construct or adopt engineering solutions when they were really absolutely necessary. A second output from the Combating Canada's Rising Flood Costs report was also a framework for natural infrastructure project implementation. And you can see this in the wheel on the slide. So there are 6 steps. The first is community engagement. The second, watershed and climate risk assessment. Third being materiality assessment to really identify what the key issues are. Feasibility assessment, economic benefits assessment, and then design, construction, and maintenance. And some of you are probably thinking, well, this sounds pretty much like what we would do for a typical project, and we already do this at the watershed scale. I think the key thing that I would like to discuss is how we achieve this economic benefits assessment. Essentially, what we are suggesting in the Intech Centre report is that we should really look at the triple bottom line benefits. So benefits in an economic sense, a social sense, and an environmental sense, and really valuing the benefits of natural infrastructure solutions. So when it comes to valuing natural infrastructure, we often look at what are called ecosystem services. These are frequently divided into 4 categories, as you see on the wheel: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. You may also realize that there are several services on this wheel, and we have only mentioned 4 in the presentation up to now. So we have been talking about flooding and erosion control, carbon storage, and temperature, which all fall under the regulation ecosystem service category. We've also mentioned building natural capital, which relates to biodiversity and habitats under the supporting category in this wheel. But we haven't even mentioned cultural or provisioning services. So provisioning is things like fish and wood. Cultural is things like aesthetics, recreation, education. So there's a whole rake of services we haven't even talked about, hence the win, 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 win approach. So I included 3 wins, but I really could have included many more. And I think the key thing is that these services are offered by natural infrastructure solutions, and grey infrastructure or traditional engineering solutions that do not work with nature just don't offer these benefits. To emphasize what I just mentioned in the previous slide, here is a comparison of grey and natural infrastructure solutions side by side. So here we see the costs involved: pre-construction, construction, post-construction, administration. Basically similar costs for each different type of solution, really. And many of you are obviously very familiar with this kind of project life cycle and the costs that are involved. However, what is very different is when we look at the benefits. So whereas with our grey infrastructure, we may be delivering stormwater storage, if we deliver this service using natural infrastructure, we can actually deliver a whole rake of multiple benefits that are not provided at all by the grey infrastructure. And this table includes a limited number of the benefits when you think back to the wheel that we saw in the previous slide. So there could be more crosses here for natural infrastructure depending on what the project is. So the problem at the moment is that we are looking at the costs and we're not necessarily routinely looking at the benefits and counting all these benefits because they're not as readily monetized as the costs. So how do we set about valuing natural infrastructure and the ecosystem services that it provides? So in environmental economics assessments, we often talk about total economic value. And we may look at use values or non-use values. And use values could be current use values, as in we are actively using the resource. This may include consumptive uses like eating something, or non-consumptive uses like recreational use, for example. Use values also include future use or option value, which is paying or putting a value on the option of using the resource in the future. In terms of non-use values, we may look at altruistic or bequest values of the price that people would be willing to pay to pass a resource or a natural infrastructure onto next generations. There are also stewardship or preservation values of what people are willing to pay, or the value they place on preserving something, not even if they don't use it. And these different types of value add up to the total economic value. Obviously, this is a fairly complex field, and environmental economists are obviously experts in this field. But there are other alternatives to doing a bespoke economic valuation for each time that we want to value a resource. In many valuation studies looking at monetizing natural infrastructure values, we often use the benefit transfer method. This method is used to estimate economic values for ecosystem services by transferring available information from studies that have already been completed in another location and or context that are comparable to the study of concern. So obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages of this method and not doing a bespoke study for each particular natural infrastructure project we're looking at. In terms of advantages, the benefit transfer method is obviously less costly than the original valuation studies. It can also provide a rapid estimating tool and can be used as a screening technique to determine if a more detailed study is required. Using benefit transfer, we can also help reduce bias that can be introduced due to methodological differences where comparing similar sites. For example, comparing the value of natural infrastructure project in one area or another. We can also consider the disadvantages of this method. Since it's not a bespoke method considering all the potential characteristics of the site in question, it may not be appropriate unless the sites share location and user-specific characteristics. Unit value estimates can also quickly become dated. And good comparable studies may not be available in the locality or in the area of interest. Benefit transfers can also only be as accurate as the initial value estimate. Having said all this, benefit transfer method is widely used, and so long as the limitations are appreciated, it can help to at least value ecosystem services in a way that can be figured in the bottom line and in a dollar value when we're looking at different alternative options. So I now wanted to provide you with some figures, some illustrations of valuing natural infrastructure in action in Canada. And I'm not going to read the whole table, but I just wanted to provide an idea of some of the figures that have been estimated through environmental economic valuations. For example, in the metropolitan area of Quebec City, here in Quebec, wetlands manage excess rainwater and reduce flood damages. And these services are estimated to be worth $49.8 million. So this is not an insignificant amount. In the city of Hamilton, Ontario, as another example, a wetland complex restoration project was undertaken to reduce flooding and provide recreation and other services. So the project itself cost $15.3 million to restore the wetland. However, this was compared to $28.5 million for the engineering solution. So this illustrates that natural infrastructure projects are not necessarily more expensive than engineering alternatives. And the services that are provided by the wetland complex restoration are valued at up to $44.2 million. So this just provides you with some case studies and a feel for the types of figures that the ecosystem services provide a value. In terms of an overview of progress now, we're first going to look at Canada and then move to more an international scale. So in terms of in Canada, over the last 10 years, we've seen several municipal scale initiatives to first inventory and value natural infrastructure, as in what exists on the ground at present. We've seen some evolution from valuation based largely on spatial data and using the benefit transfer approach to valuation of certain functions, for example, in flood and erosion risk reduction. So using modeling to work out if we restored natural infrastructure, how much the flood risk really would be reduced, and then valuing that in terms of damages avoided, and this up to the river basin scale. We've also seen practical examples incorporating natural infrastructure and natural assets into municipal asset management planning, so that municipalities are looking at forward planning the money and the resources that they need to protect and manage the natural assets alongside their engineered assets. And I think this is very important in terms of how natural assets are viewed, in the terms that we do need to spend time and money in maintaining them. However, what we've also seen is that these activities are often funded as additional or add-on activities undertaken by forward-thinking municipalities, NGOs, research groups. It's definitely not the norm. There's also no standard methodology for appraisal of natural infrastructure projects for flood and erosion risk management. And we have no standard methodology of valuing natural assets, for example. And one thing that kind of it builds on this is that because we do have no standard methodology, we at the moment natural assets and inherited natural assets are not reflected in financial reporting, and there's actually an exclusion in place at present in public sector financial reporting, so we cannot put these figures on the balance sheet. So I think the challenge is, how do we mainstream in the new nature economy the consideration of natural infrastructure and really valuing our natural assets? Here in Canada, we have seen some initiatives to boost uptake of natural infrastructure projects, in particular looking at controlling flooding and erosion risks. One of these innovative financing solutions is looking at nature-based insurance solutions. For example, at the moment, the Insurance Bureau of Canada and Swiss Re and Municipal Natural Assets Initiative are working with 20 municipalities to really explore the potential for developing insurance solutions that will help restore nature-based solutions nature systems if they're damaged. So that's one of the avenues that's being explored, or whether potentially municipalities could achieve rebates on their municipal insurance, for example, if they had implemented a natural infrastructure solution to reduce their flood risk. We're also seeing active interest from institutional investors in investing in natural capital in Canada. For example, one of our institutional investors and our federal government have actively invested in the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund from the UN, and they're actively looking for opportunities in Canada. However, one of the things that I have noticed is that natural capital and economic activity are still really seen as two separate entities. And they basically, we're looking at natural capital providing ecosystem goods and services, and economic activity having impacts on our natural capital, when really it should be part of the same system. In terms of progress internationally, we are seeing increased engagement of national governments and bespoke funding streams aimed at natural infrastructure solutions. For example, in the UK, the natural capital accounts are published every year, and there are funding streams specifically targeted at natural flood management, for example, that are expected to restore sections of wetland habitat or habitat that will help with flood risk reduction, and also sections of river restoration. In a similar vein, we see in FEMA there's now the ecosystem service benefits are being included in benefit cost analysis for FEMA's mitigation programs policy. So we're seeing incorporation of the consideration of natural infrastructure into formal decision making, which is great. We're also seeing that global business dependency and opportunities are being highlighted by the economic and financial sector. As an example of this, Swiss Re Institute have basically produced a biodiversity and ecosystem services index for the whole world. So looking at where the index is currently high and low, and we're looking at whether we can actually overlay this with flood risk to see where actually restoration of natural infrastructure could help improve biodiversity while at the same time presenting against flood risk and erosion. And really, we're looking forward to now we're at the embarking on the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration up until 2030. So really, we're hoping that this is the time where we're going to see movement on really getting natural infrastructure solutions going. So I'm nearing the end of my presentation now, and I hope that one message that comes across is that our economies are embedded with nature. So basically, investment in natural infrastructure is an investment in our economy. And the benefits of natural infrastructure include flood and erosion risk management, but they also include a whole range of other benefits that we also need to be accounting for. So I'd like to draw attention to a couple of quotes from the recent Dasgupta review, because I think it really sets the scene as what the challenge is in going forward. So one of the quotes is that the solution starts with understanding and accepting a simple truth: our economies are embedded within nature, not external to it. So basically, if we're helping nature, we're also helping ourselves. The second quote was that I really found interesting is that we are all asset managers. Individuals, businesses, governments, and international organizations all manage assets through our spending and investment decisions. And really, we have very poorly managed our natural assets. While human capital and produce capital have both increased over the period of study of the review, natural capital actually was found to have decreased by 40%, which really is not a good reflection on our ability as asset managers. And basically that we need to make investment decisions that include for flood and erosion risk reduction, but that also bear in mind the additional benefits that we can have in order to achieve this win-win-win-win approach that I've been talking about. So I'm going to finish with some key opportunities that I see for the future that we can really start putting into practice. The first is to use total economic valuation to recognize and maximize multiple benefits in decision making. So this is at the project appraisal process, and basically is something that we could all put into place in our own projects. And this would mean that basically we're making sounder economic decisions and comparing different solutions, but looking at the true values of the benefits. The second opportunity I see is creation of new natural capital markets. For example, this may include payment for ecological services, land stewardship agreements, or rebates for climate resilience measures. And these services exist in other countries in Canada, and I think there's some good examples, but I see a growth in this area, and I hope there's a growth in this area in Canada in particular. The third key opportunity I see is disclosure of asset values in public sector financial reporting, or at least disclosure of nature-related risks. In a similar situation to, we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures already exists and is working on this very issue. So I think once we have natural assets reflected on our balance sheets, then we will really start properly valuing them. I think another key opportunity is infrastructure funding targeted to natural assets, with a narrower definition within green infrastructure. So really green infrastructure funding can be a range of different assets, but really we need some natural asset funding that's more specific to supporting our natural areas. And then the fifth key opportunity I see is preservation and restoration of natural infrastructure as a cornerstone of climate action, but also as underpinning economic transition and public health. Often natural infrastructure is seen as good for the environment, good for climate resilience. Ultimately, it's good for economy and it's good for us. So 3 key takeaways. Hopefully you think, well done for getting this far. So this is what I want you to understand from the education session. Natural infrastructure is often a viable option to reduce flood and erosion as well as achieving multiple benefits. Number 2, valuing all benefits frequently makes a clear economic case for using natural infrastructure as an alternative to grey infrastructure or in complement to grey infrastructure. The two are not mutually exclusive. For example, we can combine where it's appropriate. Number 3, flood and erosion management professionals, like yourselves, like me, have a key role to play in protecting, restoring, and managing natural infrastructure as assets and increasing natural capital. And this is the basis of our economy. So I'd hope you've enjoyed this education session, and that's provided a few ideas that will kind of give you something to think about. If you do want to reach out and find out more about the work of the INTEC Center on Climate Adaptation, or you have any questions, then please do feel free to contact me at my email address, which is on the slide. One of the weird things about recording this in advance is that we miss the kind of question and answer and interaction that we may have had in a live stream event or even previously in person. So really, if you do want to find out more, do let me know, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.